They said no one could ever cheat death. But in 1788, a condemned woman stood before the gallows and declared she would not die. What happened next shocked the crowd, defied the law, and left history with a mystery that still chills us today. Do you dare witness the execution that went horribly wrong? Stay until the end. And do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. The morning air was thick with silence, broken only by the slow groan of wood as the gallows swayed against the wind. The crowd had gathered before the sun had risen, as if the promise of death could draw them faster than the promise of prayer. Men leaned on canes, their breath visible in the pale chill, while women clutched their shawls tighter. Children perched on their shoulders to glimpse the ritual that would erase a life. Yet among them, whispers spread of something unnatural, something already broken before the rope had been tied. The condemned woman stood tall, her face unmarked by fear, her lips curving into a faint smile that unsettled even those who had demanded her punishment. She had made a claim the night before that echoed through the taverns and narrow alleys of the town. She would not die upon the gallows. The rope would fail, she had said. The noose would betray its purpose. Death itself would turn away from her. It was not the kind of boast a soul at the edge of eternity should have spoken, yet she spoke it without hesitation, as if she knew a truth that no one else could touch. The executioner, hardened by years of repetition, kept glancing at her with unease, his hands shaking as he checked the rope once more, pulling at it, listening for the sound of strain. He had carried out many deaths, but never before had the condemned dared to look him in the eyes with something that felt less like despair and more like amusement. The magistrates watched from their elevated seats, unsettled by the murmurs of the crowd that grew louder with each passing moment. The woman's calmness was more disturbing than screams would have been. The town had expected tears, prayers, perhaps the frantic confessions of a guilty heart. Instead, they saw defiance dressed in flesh, a living figure who seemed already beyond their reach. The gallows stood as a promise, a wooden monument to the certainty of law and finality. It was never supposed to fail. Yet, as the executioner prepared the noose, as the crowd pressed forward, some swore the wood shivered, as if rejecting the role it had been carved to play. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of the woman's voice. No one could agree later on what she said, only that it was quiet, steady, and directed not at the crowd, not at the rope, but at the space above her head. Some believed she prayed. Others said she mocked heaven itself. The hush that fell upon the square was not the reverent silence of people awaiting justice, but the nervous pause of animals sensing a predator. It felt wrong. All of it felt wrong. The woman looked out at the hundreds of eyes fixed on her and smiled again, as if she were watching them, not the other way around. She tilted her head, her hair brushing against her shoulders, and in that moment it was as if she were the executioner, and they were the condemned. Death was expected to arrive with speed and certainty. The drop, the snap, the silence. That was the order of things. But order trembled that morning. A question hung in the air like smoke, spreading through every chest, gripping every throat, unspoken yet undeniable. If a gallows could fail, if death itself could falter, then what awaited them all at the end of their days? The year was 1788, a time when death was not hidden away in sterile chambers, but carried out in public squares, where the living could watch the law demonstrate its power. Executions were ritual, binding the community together in the certainty that order could be restored with a single violent act. The gallows was not only a device of wood and rope, but also a stage, where fear was performed for the benefit of those who still walked free. In this town, isolated by rivers and hills, each hanging was remembered in detail. The crimes, the condemned, the final words, all whispered into memory, so that parents could frighten their children into obedience. Yet none were spoken of with such anticipation as the woman, who now stood beneath the shadow of the platform. Her life had been a story of disobedience. She had grown up in narrow streets, where survival demanded sharpness of wit and swiftness of hand. She had stolen, deceived, and struck bargains that others considered unclean. Some said she lured men with promises and left them with nothing but their emptied purses. Others swore she had taken part in more violent crimes, ones that left marks on flesh and blood on stone. What was certain was that she had been judged beyond redemption. The magistrates had deliberated, the priests had spoken, and the rope had been ordered. For most, this should have been the end of her story. Yet she carried herself as though the trial had been a play, the sentence a line delivered for the crowd, and the gallows merely another stage upon which she would, performed out the people of the town, gathered not only to see punishment, but to see whether her audacity would collapse in the face of death. She had walked to the prison gates days before her execution, with her head held high, telling guards that she had placed a wager against her own death. She promised them that the gallows would not claim her. Her words spread through the taverns and the workshops, carried by drunk voices and sharpened by fear. Some dismissed her as mad. Others whispered that she had knowledge of charms and dark pacts, that she had studied forbidden texts or spoken to travelers who came from lands where the dead were said to walk again. These whispers grew until the execution day arrived, and the crowd pressed close, eager to see if she truly knew something that the rest of them did not. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, their small hands gripping tightly, as if afraid that the condemned might somehow step into the crowd and drag them away. Old women muttered prayers beneath their breath, refusing to look directly at her. Men who prided themselves on courage found themselves silent, uncertain why her calm unsettled them more than a scream would have. The square itself seemed transformed, the familiar houses and cobblestones feeling foreign, as though they were all standing within a place meant for another world. The magistrates tried to cloak themselves in authority, their robes heavy, their expressions severe. Yet their eyes betrayed unease. They had delivered death countless times, and every condemned prisoner before her had broken down in some way. Some had pleaded, some had wept, some had cursed, but all had bent under the weight of the inevitable. She did not bend. She stared at them with a stillness that suggested she saw something beyond them, something higher, or perhaps lower, than the reach of law. And in that gaze, the magistrates felt the thinness of their power. The air that year was heavy with hunger and unrest. Crops had failed in nearby villages. Disease had touched households without warning. People were already raw, their faith stretched thin. The gallows was supposed to remind them that control remained intact, that chaos could be answered with certainty. Yet this woman, with her strange smile and unbroken calm, turned the execution into something else. It became not only punishment, but a question. The community had come to watch her die, but beneath their excitement pulsed a fear they could not name. What if she did not? The days before the execution unfolded like a slow tightening of rope around the neck of the town itself. Every conversation seemed to circle back to her, to the condemned woman who carried herself as though death were a guest she had already turned away at the door. In the prison yard, she did not weep or whisper prayers. She laughed softly, as if amused by the guards who watched her every move. At night, when footsteps echoed in the stone corridors and the damp air thickened, the jailer claimed to hear her speaking to herself. Yet it did not sound like a confession or a plea. He swore she spoke as if addressing someone unseen, her words low and steady, broken by long pauses, as if she were listening for an answer. When he pressed his ear to the iron bars, the sound seemed to drift not from her mouth, but from the air itself, as though she were repeating what she had been told. By the eve of her execution, the town was fevered with speculation. She had told a servant who delivered her last meal that the rope would betray its purpose. She told another that the drop would not break her, that the wood would not hold. Each word was carried outward like smoke until no house in the town was free from her voice. Some laughed and said she was clinging to madness. Others feared that she spoke with a knowledge beyond mortal flesh. Children refused to sleep near the windows, afraid that if she did not die, she would return through the night to claim them. Wives woke their husbands to ask if they believed it. Husbands lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unwilling to say aloud that they did. The morning came with a sky that seemed too pale, drained of color. The crowd gathered quickly, pressing against the wooden barriers that separated them from the scaffold. Mothers clutched their children closer, yet did not leave, for they needed to see the promise fulfilled. Men argued over whether she had bargained with demons or simply gone mad, their voices rising over the restless murmur. The executioner checked the noose again and again, his thick hands trembling. He rubbed the hemp between his fingers, as though searching for a flaw that should not have been there. Each time he pulled the rope taut, it gave a sound that seemed too sharp, like a cry held inside the fibers. The woman was led up the wooden steps with her wrists bound, though she walked as though she were guiding the men beside her, rather than being forced by them. Her eyes roamed the crowd, settling on faces, holding them until the people looked away. It was not the gaze of one about to die, but of one measuring, weighing, and remembering. When she reached the platform, she did not look at the priest who offered final prayers. She tilted her head toward the sky, her lips moving in a quiet rhythm, not the words of Scripture, but something else entirely. When the noose was placed around her neck, the crowd held its breath. The executioner hesitated, his hand lingering on the lever. He had never faltered before, but her calm seemed to hollow out his resolve. The magistrate gestured sharply, and the lever was pulled. The trapdoor fell open with the familiar sound of wood striking wood, and her body dropped. But death did not arrive. Some swore the rope stretched unnaturally, bending as if refusing its duty. Others said they saw her twist in mid-air, her body writhing in a way no broken neck could allow. The sound of the snap that always followed the fall never came. Instead, there was a silence so heavy it pressed against the ears of the living. She dangled, suspended, her eyes wide open, her lips still moving faintly, as though finishing the last lines of a prayer or a curse. Then the rope jerked, loosened, and her body convulsed violently, not with death, but with life clawing for breath. The crowd screamed, some covering their children's eyes, others pushing forward in horror to see if it was true. The executioner panicked, rushing forward to steady the rope, his face pale with disbelief. He had hanged dozens before, but never had the rope failed. The magistrates shouted for order, but their voices shook. The priest fell to his knees, his prayers stumbling as if words themselves no longer carried weight. What should have been swift and certain was now a spectacle of dread. The condemned did not break. She gasped, she choked, but her eyes still burned, wide and unyielding. What had gone wrong? The rope had been tested. The gallows had stood for years. Nothing in the ritual should have faltered. Yet in that moment, every certainty the town had clung to unraveled. The question was no longer whether she would die, but what had been unleashed when she did not. The aftermath of the failed execution left the square in a fever of disbelief. People fled in every direction, clutching their children, spilling into alleyways as if the woman's gasping breaths could spread like a disease. Yet the officials did not allow the moment to fade. The magistrates demanded order, demanded that testimony be gathered, demanded that the gallows itself be examined, as though wood and rope could be interrogated into giving up the truth. The executioner, pale and trembling, insisted that the rope had been strong, that he had tested it 3 times, pulling it against his own weight until it threatened to split the timber frame. The priest spoke of sin, of the possibility that the condemned had been allowed one final chance to repent. But even as he said the words, his voice faltered. None could explain how the fall had not broken her neck, how she had twisted in ways the human body was not meant to twist. Witness accounts were written down, though they contradicted each other at every turn. Some swore the rope snapped mid-her, though the rope itself remained whole when examined. Others claimed they saw her body suspended longer than it should have been, her legs kicking not in the panic of strangulation, but in some unnatural rhythm, as if she were resisting the rope itself. One man swore her lips continued to move in silent words, even as her face darkened. A woman fainted, and upon waking, swore she had seen hands in the air above the platform, pale and thin, gripping the rope and holding it aloft before vanishing in the blink of an eye. These testimonies were dismissed by officials, but the whispers carried further than the written reports ever could. The rope was inspected in full view of the crowd that remained. Its fibers were examined, twisted, untwisted, and compared to others cut from the same coil. No weakness was found, no break, no mark of tampering. The gallows was measured, each plank struck with mallets, each nail pulled and examined. All was found sturdy. There was no flaw in the wood, no hidden crack in the beam. By every natural measure, the execution should have ended as it always had. Yet the woman lived, her breath ragged but present, her eyes unbroken in their strange defiance. Some physicians were called upon, their words carried with the weight of authority. They claimed her neck might have been unusually strong, her spine shaped in some unnatural way, or that the drop had been miscalculated. But even they could not explain the silence that followed her fall, the absence of the expected sound of bone splitting, a strange delay before the rope tightened around her throat. One physician admitted quietly to a magistrate that when he touched her pulse, it did not feel like the pulse of the dying. It felt like something else, something heavy, irregular, unlike anything he had felt in a human body. His words were never written into the official record. The executioner himself fell into despair. He insisted he had done nothing wrong, that his craft was perfect. His hands shook as he described the way she fell, the way she seemed to catch on the air itself before the rope drew taut. He begged the magistrates not to force him to attempt the act again. His eyes darted constantly toward the woman, who even in her weakened state seemed to stare at him with mocking calm, as if she knew his strength, his skill, and his years of practice meant nothing. Debate raged in the halls of authority. Some demanded that the sentence be carried out again, immediately, with a new rope and reinforced timber. Others argued that the failure was divine intervention, that to try again would be to defy a message delivered from above. Yet even the priests could not agree. Some claimed heaven had spared her to inspire repentance. Others whispered that no divine hand could look so favorably upon one condemned for her crimes, and that perhaps it was not heaven at all that had intervened. The records that remain from that week are filled with uncertainty. Testimonies overlap and break apart. Official reports contradict the murmurs of the crowd. What is consistent is the fear that followed. No one could agree on what they had seen, but none could forget it. The gallows, once a symbol of certainty, had become a site of unease, a wooden frame that no longer promised the end it was built to deliver. Every board, every knot of rope seemed tainted by the failure, as though the device itself had been shamed. The condemned woman lingered, her breath shallow but steady, her eyes drifting shut only when she chose, as if sleep belonged to her will alone. She had not escaped entirely, but neither had she been claimed. The question hung heavier than the rope itself. Was it a flaw in the gallows, or had death itself stepped aside? And if death could be delayed, even mocked, then how could any of them trust that the order of their world was not already breaking apart? The crowd left the square in fragments, not as one body satisfied by justice, but as scattered shadows, broken by what they had seen. Children who had once been dragged to executions to learn obedience now screamed in their sleep, crying out that the rope was alive, that it writhed like a serpent around their throats. Parents hushed them, though their own hands shook, their own eyes wide open long into the night. Families gathered around tables that evening in silence, bowls of food left untouched, as if eating while the condemned woman still drew breath would be an offense. The air of the town thickened with unease, a stillness that carried through the streets, as if the execution had not ended but lingered, suspended like her body had been in the moment between life and death. Merchants who had come to the square to see justice done could no longer sell their goods without glancing at the gallows, which still stood tall against the pale sky. They whispered that its timbers were cursed, that the sound of the trapdoor echoed at night long after the crowd had left. Some claimed to see her figure swinging there in the darkness, even when the platform was empty. Farmers passing through the town for trade began to avoid the square altogether, steering their carts down narrower paths, unwilling to let their animals glance toward the structure that had failed in its purpose. The gallows was once a reminder of law. Now it was a scar on the town, a constant reminder that certainty could be shattered. Her family, if they could be called that, reacted in ways that unsettled the community further. One sister, thin and pale, stood at the edge of the square during the attempt and smiled faintly when the rope failed. She did not weep, did not cry out, but looked into the eyes of those around her with a pride that chilled them. A man who claimed to be her cousin shouted that she had won her wager, that she had proved herself beyond the grasp of their judgment. He was beaten by the crowd and dragged away, yet his words remained, echoing in the ears of those who had heard them. Some began to wonder if her kin had known all along, if they too had trusted in something darker than law or rope. The magistrates found themselves unable to command the respect they once held. Their robes felt heavy, their words thin. When they walked through the town, people no longer lowered their heads in deference. Instead, they looked with suspicion, as though the failure of the gallows had stripped away the illusion of control. The execution had been more than punishment. It had been a ritual meant to prove that the law could conquer chaos. That ritual had been broken, and in its breaking, the authority of the town cracked like brittle stone. The executioner himself became a ghost of a man. His hands trembled constantly, and he refused to leave his house except at night, when the streets were nearly empty. He was haunted not only by the woman's survival, but by the sound, or rather the absence of sound, that still rang in his ears. He spoke of the missing snap, a silence that followed her fall, a silence heavier than thunder. He confessed in hushed tones to his wife that he no longer believed death was inevitable, that perhaps some souls could not be taken by rope or by blade. His wife left him soon after, unwilling to live under the roof of a man who had lost his faith in the one certainty that ordered all lives. The finality of death. The community changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. People began to avoid speaking of their own mortality. Funerals were held in tighter circles, hushed and hurried, as though to mention death too openly would invite the same defiance they had witnessed. Some fell into paranoia, convinced that the condemned woman's survival had marked them, that they too would face some unnatural fate when their time came. Others sank into despair, believing that if the gallows could fail, then nothing in their world could be trusted. Children refused to walk past the square, clinging to fences or doors until dragged away. The old muttered that they had seen omens before, strange birds, twisted trees, the sound of footsteps where no one walked, but none so clear, none so defiant. A ritual meant to close a life had instead torn open something larger, something that could not be contained. And in that opening, fear seeped into every corner of the town. Not the sharp fear of punishment, but the heavy fear of uncertainty. What haunted them most was not the woman herself, but the realization she left behind. Death had been their anchor, the one truth that settled all debts and silenced all defiance. But when they watched her dangle and gasp, and yet refused to break, the anchor lifted. For the first time, they felt themselves adrift in a world where even the end could no longer be trusted. The days that followed the failed execution were filled not with relief, but with debate, accusation, and dread. The town could not ignore what had happened. Something had gone wrong in a ritual that was meant to never falter. And when order collapses, the human mind seeks explanations, however fragile or strange. The magistrates convened behind closed doors, their voices raised in arguments that spilled into the corridors of the courthouse. Some insisted that the woman be hanged again, without delay, with a new rope, a new platform, and a new executioner. Others whispered that to try again would be to tempt forces they could not control. What if she survived a second time? What if she proved herself beyond death altogether? An inspection was ordered. The gallows was dismantled plank by plank, the rope unwound and examined until its fibers frayed beneath the pressure of so many hands. Officials insisted that there had been no flaw in the timber or the cord. Everything was as it should have been, everything as it always had been. But the failure remained. And so new theories began to rise, filling the silence where truth should have been. One camp clung to the notion of human error. They said the executioner had pulled the lever too slowly, or that the trapdoor had been constructed incorrectly, shortening the drop. They claimed her neck had been spared by chance, her survival nothing more than the cruel luck of a miscalculation. Yet even as these words were spoken, doubt lingered in every eye. The executioner had been practiced, meticulous. Could years of experience truly collapse in a single moment? And if it had been error, why had the silence afterward felt so unnatural, so heavy, as though something greater than wood and rope had intervened? Another camp turned to sabotage. They accused her family, her associates, perhaps even a secret lover within the town, of weakening the gallows or tampering with the rope. They whispered that someone had bribed a guard or swapped materials in the night. But no evidence was ever found. The gallows stood unbroken, the rope as strong as it had ever been. And if sabotage had been the cause, it should have left traces, a mark, a cut, a weakness. None were discovered. Beyond these rational attempts to explain the unexplainable, darker theories began to spread like smoke. Some claimed the woman had made a bargain, that her wager against death had not been a boast, but a contract. They spoke of forbidden rites whispered in the prison, of voices answering her in the dark, of strange marks found burned into the stones near her cell. A guard claimed he had seen her shadow move when her body was still, stretching against the wall like something alive. The magistrates dismissed his testimony, but the story took root, carried from mouth to mouth, until it was believed more readily than the official record. The priests found themselves divided. A few declared that heaven had intervened, sparing her so that she might repent and turn her soul toward salvation. But others refused this interpretation. They insisted no divine hand would spare a woman condemned for her crimes, and that her survival was not a gift from above, but a warning from below. They whispered of her mocking calm, of the way she had smiled at the crowd, of the silence that followed her fall, and declared that such things belonged not to the light, but to the depths. Their words spread terror through the town, for if her survival had been unholy, then the failure of the gallows was not only mechanical but spiritual. Investigators brought in a physician from another city, a man who prided himself on reason. He examined her body and declared that her neck showed no fracture, no break. He claimed her survival was a matter of endurance, that her body had resisted strangulation longer than most. Yet even he admitted unease when he placed his hand upon her chest. Her heartbeat was irregular, slow and heavy, as though each beat echoed with something more than blood. He confessed to a colleague that it did not feel entirely human. Theories multiplied until the town itself fractured beneath them. Some clung to accident, others to conspiracy, still others to the supernatural. But none could agree, and none could settle the unease that gnawed at them. The gallows had failed, and whether by flaw of wood, hand of man, or shadow of something darker, no explanation could mend the rupture it left behind. As nights grew longer, whispers took on new shapes. People said they saw her standing at the window of her cell, watching the moon, her lips moving in silent words no one could hear. Others swore that her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, like embers refusing to die. The officials dismissed these reports as hysteria, but the townspeople did not forget. For even in their search for answers, they felt the weight of something deeper, something unspoken. Perhaps the true question was not how she had survived, but whether she had ever been meant to die at all. The failure of the gallows lingered far longer than the woman's ragged breath. Even after her body was carried away, even after the magistrates sealed the reports, and the officials insisted that the matter was finished, the town did not recover. The square remained a place people avoided, its stones heavy with memory. The gallows, though dismantled, left behind an invisible shadow. To pass through the space where it had stood was to feel the pressure of a silence that seemed never to lift. For years after, children whispered stories about her, daring each other to speak her name near the square, while old men swore the air still carried the faint echo of creaking wood when no wind blew. The woman herself became more myth than memory. Some claimed she had died days later in her cell, her body finally surrendering to the rope's unfinished work. Others swore she had been released in secret, spirited away into the night, so that the shame of her survival would not follow the magistrates forever. There were even those who insisted she had walked calmly out of her cell and into the hills, untouched, unbroken, carrying with her the proof that death itself could falter. None of these tales were confirmed, and perhaps that was what gave them power. Certainty was gone, and in its absence, stories flourished. Her defiance unsettled something deep within the human heart. The gallows was not meant only to kill. It was meant to reassure, to show the living that law was unshakable, that death was inevitable, that the world still held order. But when the rope failed, when the silence smothered the snap that should have ended her life, the ritual collapsed. The people realized that what they had always believed to be solid might instead be fragile. Death, the one truth that shadowed every man, woman, and child, had slipped its grip for a single moment. And once loosened, that certainty could never be restored. The case was written into ledgers, catalogued in quiet ink as an unfortunate accident. But no ledger could contain what the people had seen with their own eyes. The magistrates spoke of closure, but no one believed them. The priest preached of repentance, but his voice cracked when he spoke of death. And the executioner, broken by his failure, vanished into obscurity, his name spoken only in pity or in fear, depending on who remembered. What endures is not the record, but the question. Did she survive because the rope failed? Or did the rope fail because she survived? Did she carry within her some knowledge, some bargain, some defiance of flesh that none could see? Or had death itself chosen to turn away that morning, leaving her hanging in the space between worlds as a reminder that nothing, not even the final act of life, can be guaranteed? The story remains because it haunts. It whispers in the corners of memory, where certainty should reside, that perhaps certainty never existed at all. Perhaps the end that waits for each of us is not as fixed as we believe. Perhaps the gallows, the grave, the silence of the earth, perhaps all of it is weaker than we dare admit. And if death itself can falter, if the rope can fail, then what else waits in the shadows, waiting for the moment to slip its knot? If you are still here, listening to this story, ask yourself why. Perhaps it is because you, too, feel the cold touch of that question, the one that no priest, no magistrate, no rope could ever silence. And perhaps you cannot look away, because you sense that the same uncertainty might one day come for you. If this story unsettled you, if it kept you leaning closer with each breath, then do not let it end here. Like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so that when the next tale of darkness and mystery rises, you will be here to witness it. Because some stories do not die. They wait, patient and silent, like the woman beneath the gallows, daring you to believe you're safe.